Witnesses to take their seats, and members as well. Seeing the clock at 3:30 or past, I will call the meeting to order. And to start with, I will say, pursuant to Standing Order 1082, follow up on the creation of the budgetary or the parliamentary budget officer, as provided for in the Federal Accountability Act. We have with us from the Library of Parliament, Mr. William R. Young, the librarian. Our parliamentary librarian, and you have with you, I guess, some other guests that I would ask you to introduce to the committee. And with that, I will. We wait for your presentation, and I first of all want to apologize. I know you didn't have an awful lot of time to prepare, but nonetheless you're here, and that's great. We appreciate you being here. We have you for a first hour, and we will open the floor to your presentation to the committee and then follow it up with a round of questioning. So with that, the floor is yours, sir.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to meet with the committee today and provide you with a status report on our efforts to establish the Parliamentary Budget Officer within the Library of Parliament. J'ai invité Jacques Sabourin, Directeur Général Intérimaire.
I've invited Jacques Sabourin, the Acting Director General, Parliamentary Information and Research Service, as well as Mr. Alan Darling,
Parliamentary Budget Officer. I will tell you, Alan was a former Deputy Secretary to Cabinet, Deputy Secretary of the Treasury Board, and most recently has been working with the World Bank and advising developing nations on their budgetary and fiscal requirements. So we're here today to listen to your advice, recommendations regarding the organization and work of the PBO, and they will help me answer any questions that you may have. En travaillant à établir la fonction de directeur,
in my efforts to establish the Parliamentary Budget Officer, I have tried to be consistent in following four guiding principles. Firstly, to implement the law as set out in the Parliament of Canada Act. Secondly, to provide non-partisan service to parliamentarians, which have been and continues to be the hallmark of the Library of Parliament for over 130 years. Thirdly, to strengthen Parliament's institutional capacity to hold government to account, in this case by giving Parliament access to additional expertise on economic and fiscal issues. Fourthly, to ensure that parliamentarians continue to receive the best possible service from the whole library.
It is important to note that, above all, our efforts have been guided by the legislation and by our mandate to establish an office that is independent and nonpartisan, that will provide services to both houses and all parties. You are all aware that the Library of Parliament plays a unique role in the provision of professional, nonpartisan services to members of the House and Senators and to support you in your work. As this work evolves and adapts to change, the library must also evolve if it is to meet its overarching commitment to effectively serve Parliament and you, its clients. Part of the library's evolution must be integrating the PBO within the organization to provide enhanced advice and analysis on the state of the economy, the nation's finances, and the expenditures of government. Locating the officer within the Library of Parliament means that members of the House and Senators can rest assured that he or she will function as their servant, operating within the library's mandated approach and professional ethos in its service to Parliament. Appointing the officer and creating this capacity allows the library to build on the strong foundations of expertise we already have in place. It avoids duplication of effort or resources and generally provides for economies of scale wherever possible. In short, it provides us with an opportunity to strengthen our services to you. Les fonctions confiées au directeur permettront.
While some of the functions associated with the officer will enhance the library's ability to do what it already does, there is an important new element, one that provides Parliament with a new dimension and value added in exercising fully its role in oversight of the government's fiscal plan. As you know, this means explaining the assumptions underlying that plan and assisting parliamentarians in asking relevant questions relating to the executive's economic and fiscal forecasts.
I do not think the PBO should provide an alternative fiscal forecast to the one produced by the Department of Finance. Several reputable Canadian forecasting firms already do this, and adding yet another forecast would not improve service to parliamentarians. I foresee the PBO taking a lead role with parliamentarians to provide a much more strategic approach that would enhance parliamentarians' understanding of the underlying factors affecting fiscal forecasting and the reasons why the executive is moving in a particular direction. I anticipate that the work of the PBO would focus on higher-level analysis that would improve parliamentarians' understanding of alternative public policy options that might influence future government expenditures. Comme membre du comité, vous êtes au fait de l'appui qui vous
Members are aware of the assistance already provided by the research branch staff during your review of the expenditure estimates tabled by the government. I anticipate the PBO will provide leadership in developing initiatives to tailor the presentation of information on proposed expenditures to better reflect the specific interests of parliamentarians. The Library of Parliament is already assessing the forecasts. With the additional resources available to the PBO, I would anticipate a significant improvement in the transparency and credibility in this area.
When the PBO function was included in the Parliament of Canada Act, the Treasury Board provided for an annual budget to support the officer. This currently sits at $2.7 million. Like any new operation, the PBO requires phasing in, and the library's estimates for 2008-09 include $1.6 million of the total allocation for the initial implementation of these new services to Parliament. Under the leadership of the officer, we foresee building capacity in two distinct areas. First, an economic and fiscal analysis capacity that will be staffed by experts in economic modeling and fiscal forecasting. This will enable parliamentarians to obtain access to independent analysis of the state of the economy. The second capacity, expenditure analysis, will provide broader expertise on the government's expenditure program. This will be integrated into our current work for all parliamentary committees and the staff resources that are currently allocated to them. Individual requests from parliamentarians or committees for costing proposals or costing of legislation will be prepared by the PBO, again in cooperation with our current research services staff. The amended Parliament of Canada Act, Section 7913, provides that the Governor-in-Council may select the Parliamentary Budget Officer from a list of 3 names submitted in confidence by a high-level committee formed and chaired by the Parliamentary Librarian through the Leader of the Government in the House of Commons. Une description de travail basée sur l'interprétation.
Based on the interpretation of the PBO mandate and the approach to implementing it that I have outlined for you, a job description for the officer was forwarded for approval and classification to the Privy Council Office in December 2006. I convened a discussion group in January 2007, whose members were nominated by the Canadian Association of Former Parliamentarians and represented all parties in both houses. They assisted greatly in defining the skills and experience that candidates should possess to serve Parliament well and interact effectively with parliamentarians.
In late July 2007, I received notification that the position had been classified as a GCQ5. This classification is roughly equivalent to an EX3, normally a Director General level in the public service. Following a competitive bidding process, the library contracted with the executive search firm Ray & Berntsen on August 28, 2007. Led by their senior Ottawa partner, Michel Richard, they conducted an exhaustive national search process for qualified candidates. On November 30, 2007, I convened a blue ribbon selection panel committee, which was composed of Maria Barrados, the President of the Public Service Commission, Don Drummond, the Senior Vice President and Chief Economist of the TD Bank, William G. Knight, former Commissioner, Financial Consumer Agency of Canada, and a nominee of the Canadian Association of Former Parliamentarians, and Alan Darling to my right, who is my special advisor on the PBO project. As required by the statute, the selection committee reviewed 8 of the 24 candidates that had been identified through the preliminary search process. At that time, the committee identified an additional 6 candidates to be approached for the position. The committee held interviews on December the 20th, 2007, and on its behalf, I forwarded the committee's recommendations to the Government House Leader on December the 21st, 2007. Tout le long du processus, j'ai grandement profité des observations.
Throughout the process, I have benefited greatly from the comments and advice of the Honourable Peter Milliken, Speaker of the House of Commons, and the Honourable Noel Kinsella, Speaker of the Senate. As you know, they are jointly responsible for the operations of the Library of Parliament under my direction, and therefore ultimately for the PBO.
Your invitation to appear before the committee obviously is a timely one. Selection of the PBO is a decision of the government, and I am currently waiting for the decision. Thank you. We'd be happy to respond to any questions the committee may have. I have 2 additional documents that I would like to have distributed, please. The first is a chronology of planning and implementation activities undertaken by the library to help highlight the steps that we have taken to fulfill our mandate. And the second is a report prepared for me by Ray & Berntsen on the recruitment process for the Parliamentary Budget Officer.
Okay. And thank you very much for that. We now will start our round of questioning. I've had a request to go to 5 minutes rather than 7 minutes on the first round. I seek the committee's will on that. I hear consensus, so we'll start with Mr. Fischetti. The floor is yours, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Young, for coming forward. I don't know if we'll have enough time because it looks like we're probably going to want to get our opinions in and also ask questions. So I'm going to try and do a little bit of both. My first question, obviously, you're here. We had requested that everybody appear at the same time, and you're here, I think, because you didn't want to be at the same table. So I have a problem with structure in terms of my interpretation or my understanding was that this was going to be an independent parliamentary budgetary office, and I think the word independent is missing, so that's where I'm having a little bit of difficulty. Can you help me out on that? Is it supposed to be independent so that the Library of Parliament, is the Library of Parliament not an independent entity, and that is why you were uncomfortable sitting at the table with the finance officials?
The Library of Parliament reports through the speakers. It's a parliamentary body. The others report through the executive. They're governmental bodies, so as an officer of Parliament, it's more appropriate that I appear on my own. It's not a question of not wanting to do anything.
No, and the reason, and I'll ask, and the reason I'm getting to that is because you want the parliamentary office to be part. You want it to be the sole. Where is it? You want it to be the sole reporting entity, but yet you don't want it to be independent.
It is independent within the library. The library is an independent institution. The library serves members of Parliament from all parties and in both chambers.
But the finance officials or the government does not react in that way. It does have to react on a partisanship level at certain times. Do we not need information that is nonpartisan?
But that's the purpose of the library.
Yes,
we function basically on the same basis as the Clerk of the House of Commons and the Clerk of the Senate. To serve you. We're not, I mean, June sitting up at the front of the table and Alexandre work for the Library of Parliament to provide you with advice in your functions as members of the Finance Committee. So that's overall the aim and role of the Library of Parliament. We do not report to the government. We are an independent organization designed to help parliamentarians do their job. So.
But you say here, I do not think that the PBO should provide an alternative fiscal forecast to the one produced by the Department of Finance.
Should not.
Should not.
Well, I think I'm going to
So then do you want the Parliamentary Budgetary Office to be part of finance?
No, what I'm saying is we should not necessarily build the capacity within the library because there are forecasting firms which already do this. So what we were going to do is independently contract with the forecasting firms once the officer is in place and the requirement has been determined about the nature of the forecasting. There are different ways of doing this. One would be to contract on a longer-term basis with one firm. Another might be to contract with several firms to provide information and data on the areas in which they have expertise.
Right.
Alan, do you have anything to respond?
Well, I don't mean to interrupt because our time is limited, but I'm trying to understand the way you envision it, and I want to give my 2 cents in there too, because when I was chairing the committee, we did a lot of work on this, and I felt that the independent budgetary experts or consultants were actually quite useful, and they had certain information or certain take on things that the finance officials or maybe even the Library of Parliament wouldn't otherwise have. So I believe what you just said is the correct approach. So I would have somebody or a group of people involved with the library, but the library should also have a certain amount of the budget to contract independent forecasters that have the expertise and are already doing that type of work. So that's the way I envision it, but I still don't understand is how your relationship is the Library of Parliament and the finance officials.
We are independent of the finance.
No, but how you forecast how you envision the Parliamentary Budgetary Office to be the relationship, because again, I'm quoting from your paper, I do not think that the PBO should provide an alternative fiscal forecast to one produced by the Department of Finance.
I'm going to let Alan explain this.
And then the time will be gone. Go ahead.
Okay.
Very briefly, the conceptual thinking is there are many people and many government agencies, including the Bank of Canada and the Department of Finance, who already provide Parliament with fiscal forecasts of and the state of the economy. The conception that we have tried to we've tried to develop in defining how the PBO should approach the role is to work at explaining to parliamentarians the underlying assumptions that form the basis for those positions, and to point out, in their own view and based on their own independent analysis of the economy, where there are areas that parliamentarians should probe in order to understand better whether there is an alternative interpretation that could be put on the forward projections that are contained in the fiscal documents of the government.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Craig.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Bonjour à tous.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome, gentlemen. In your presentation, Mr. Young, you say that your appearance comes at a timely one. Selection of the PBO is a decision of the government, and I'm currently awaiting their decision. So am I to understand that you will be receiving a motion from the committee that calls for the appointment of that person as soon as possible to assess the next budget, and that in light of a possible election, that person be appointed before the calling of election? Answer. I forwarded my recommendations to the government, and that is where my responsibilities end. I'm waiting just as you are. If you adopt a motion, then it's entirely your decision. But do you think it would be relevant, important for the person to be appointed before a new fiscal year begins? The budget is going to be tabled on the 26th of February. And that's going to affect the Implementation Act. So do you think that we need a decision immediately? Answer, if it's possible. The public budget officer is there to answer your questions and to provide you analysis for you. Now, the parliamentary budget officer, rather, is appointed to oversee a budget of some $2.7 billion. Can you provide us some information as to whether or not you have assessed the validity of the current figures that have been made public by the government? For example, when the Minister of Finance announced a surplus of $10.3 billion this year in its most recent economic statement, were those figures reviewed? We already have a division comprised of economists. I don't have information on those figures right now, since they are for next year. We will continue to provide you services through our economists. To answer your question, sir, there isn't any specific analysis of what you are describing. We simply don't have the resources. Because all of the resources that have been allocated to individual members have been exhausted. But those are resources that have been allocated to the parliamentary budget officers. So the answer is that we haven't begun that type of analysis. Now, can you confirm the fact that if the officer isn't appointed immediately, then he may not be operational even through the next fiscal year? So the appointment should be made as soon as possible. I think Mr. Young has already answered that question. But indeed, to be fully operational, I don't think that it should be postponed beyond the next 6 or 7 weeks. In the preparation of the mandate of the PBO, will you be publishing any documents on correspondence between departments, for instance? Answer, to my knowledge, no. But perhaps individual members of Parliament have made requests to our research branch. But as you know, that type of analysis is confidential, and it is only at the disposal of individual members. But don't you produce that type of information, those types of statistics that go to all members of Parliament. It really depends on the request that we receive from the individual member. So you don't have the power to confer any specific task to the parliamentary budget officer, because in past years, systematically, the federal government has underestimated federal surpluses. This is a reality. We've seen it for ourselves. That's exactly why the Office of the Parliamentary Budget Officer was established. Now, under the act that was passed, the PBO will have much greater access to departmental information and statistics than is currently the case. This is clearly stipulated in the legislation.
Mr. Del Mastro, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Young, I just noted at the end of your comments, you said your invitation is a timely one. Selection of the PBO is a decision of the government, and I'm currently waiting for the decision. That's contrary to my understanding of how the position would be established. My understanding is that this isn't a finance department function. It's not a government function. It's a function independent of the library to put someone in place. And I guess, obviously, the first question that I've got, and I think it's the relevant question, and I'm not looking to come down on you, but why is this taking so long? Like I'm looking at the timeline. We've known, you indicate in February, March of 2006 that the discussion started, so it was imminent that this would happen. And we had royal assent of the Accountability Act on the 12th of December 2006. That's 14 months ago. And we sit today with this position not filled. And I'm just, I think that's the relevant question. Why? And I looked at the timing that you presented with respect to who that you brought in to consider. You listed that you brought a search firm in on the 28th of August of 2007, and that on November 30th of 2007 there was a blue ribbon selection committee composed. But that again, that's almost a year after the Act received royal assent. Could we have moved a little quicker on this?
The Act received royal assent on, I believe, the 10th of December, 12th of December. I submitted a job description to the Privy Council office, which is responsible for classifying this position 10 days later. At the time, I was told I was either the first or second person affected by the Accountability Act to have submitted the job description. I waited until sometime in July, approximately 6-7 months later, to receive word from the Privy Council office about what level this job would be classified at. You have to understand, Mr. Chair, that this is a Governor and Council appointment. It is not my appointment. It is one that is made by the Governor and Council, and at this point the recommending minister is the leader of the government in the House of Commons, the government House leader. So my obligation under the Act was to launch the search process. That was done through a bidding process. So I received the classification sometime in the beginning or mid-July. The search process, I had to launch a bidding process for an executive search firm. That firm was in place at the end of August. It took them a little while. The national advertising campaign, there were ads in the Globe and Mail and La Presse, I believe, on the 24th of September. In the meantime, they began canvassing people. I believe they spoke to well over 400 individuals in terms of looking for candidates for this position. As far as I'm concerned, I moved as expeditiously as one could possibly move in expediting this process. The other thing I think that I was always aware of is that this is a new function. There isn't one like it in the Westminster system of government in any of the countries that follow the same model of government that we do. And I was very careful to try and make sure that as a new function, it would work within that system. Alan Darling may have other comments to make, but basically the delay is because of the 7-month wait.
Okay, if I could, just for clarification, is it therefore your position that you are going to put forward a name for governor and council selection?
That was all done in December.
So that has been done. You have put forward a suggested name.
The committee, the selection committee, put forward its recommendations to the government house leader before Parliament adjourned in December.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. We'll now move on to Monsieur Mulcahy.
Monsieur le Président,
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I listened attentively to what Mr. Young was saying with respect to the British-modeled parliamentary system, which is otherwise known as the Westminster system. I'm very intrigued to know the following. To his mind, is it a problem to have a British-styled system? Answer. For me, this enhances the services that we provide to parliamentarians. For me, this is a crucial addition to the information that we put at your disposal. I believe it provides you a strategic approach to your work, for example, here on the Finance Committee. Can you be a bit more specific on the challenges of integrating the duties of the PBO within a Westminster model? I'll defer to Mr. Darling, who studied that matter.
It's easier for me to explain the concepts. Essentially, the role of the Library of Parliament is to provide us as sound of analytical framework as possible in response to the needs of parliamentarians, to understand the proposals and representations that are brought before Parliament by the government. And in terms of the parliamentary budget officer, what this position represents is a capacity to improve the analytical economic understanding of what are the forces in the economy that are shaping the outcomes that will in turn determine the fiscal resources available to the government. I don't think this is a contradiction. It's really improving, providing a better analytical interpretation of what is happening in the economy so that members have a better understanding of how to interpret the government's representations to it with respect to their economic position and their fiscal numbers.
Ça, je le comprends, mais je l'ai compris depuis le début.
I understand that, and I've understood that since the beginning. What I find interesting is the reference made by Mr. Young. He said that this was a challenge to integrate the duties of the PBO into a British-inspired model. The example that we can all look to is the American model. So I'm asking you, what are the challenges? And is that one of the reasons explaining why we still do not have an appointment to the PBO? I think the answer to that is no. As Mr. Young stated, the description of duties was only formulated about 10 days after the Act passed. Does that role match the British equivalent? We did look at other models of parliamentary budget offices. In conclusion, can anyone guide members of this committee? If I am to take for granted what Mr. Darling is saying, we would very much like the office to be established. Do you have any piece of information to share with the elected members of this committee so that we can understand the discrepancy between the recommendation made in November and today, on February 13th, 2008, no action has been taken. Is there any explanation you can provide? We've prepared a timeline. I believe that representatives of the Privy Council office are here. They are appearing after me. I believe that there is a problem with the classification of this position, and this was pointed out by Ray Burnson. Are you saying that it was ranked too low? That we weren't providing a competitive salary? Is that what you're saying? Not just that, but it's a matter of status within the system as a whole. We were expecting this office to be ranked the same level as an assistant deputy minister.
Mr.
Brièvement, un niveau,
McKay.
comme M. Young l'a dit tout à l'heure, EX3 dans sa présentation.
Yes, at an EX3 level, as was said during the presentation.
Of the table when this budget, in the previous parliament we were sat on that side of the table, this parliament we're sitting on this side of the table, and all of the conversation by all of the parties has been on an independent budgetary office. The emphasis is on independent budgetary office. It wasn't sort of a rehash of whatever finance lets you see. It was an independent officer of Parliament who would interpret publicly available data so that members of Parliament would have a compare and contrast exercise with what the Department of Finance said GDP would be, what the Department of Finance said inflation would be, nominal GDP, et cetera, because for quite a number of years, both under our government and continuing under this government, the discrepancy between what the predictions were and what the reality turned out to be, it was two very separate things. And your description of a year and a half of interpretations and consulting with finance, I can see finance's sticky little paws all over this. They do not want to have any entity in contrast or arguing with or disputing, particularly not an entity from Parliament, disputing what their numbers might be for budgetary purposes. So it seems to me that the way you're interpreting the legislation itself is that you are already subservient to whatever finance deigns to give you for the purposes of this exercise. And then it gets worse, because instead of being an independent officer of Parliament, essentially you get the government to hire the person and, I assume, therefore, fire the person. And, you know, it's partisan, but this government seems awfully enthusiastic about firing independent people. You know, I don't see how this is serving members of Parliament who will want independent advice free of influence from the government.
Well, to begin with, my job is to implement the Act. I did not write the Act. And as far as the library is concerned, it is an independent institution there to serve you as members. It is not subservient to the Department of Finance. And as far as the role of the Parliamentary Budget Officer vis-a-vis the Department, I'll ask Alan to respond.
I think the characterization you indicated you expected the role of the Parliamentary Budget Officer to take is exactly the way we have interpreted how that position should be implemented. I think what's missing is the individual so that they can begin to get to work on providing the basis for developing independent analysis and advice to parliamentarians on what is happening on the state of the economy.
respect, Mr. Darling and Mr. Young, you say in your material here, I do not think that PBO should provide an alternative fiscal forecast to the one produced by the Department of Finance. And then you go on to say we want to provide more strategic approach that would enhance parliamentarians' understanding of the underlying factors. Well, with greatest respect, I thought that that's exactly what the point of this office was, to provide an alternative fiscal forecast.
If I can comment on that very briefly, if you were to ask the parliamentary budget officer to table for you a statement on the state of the economy, the GDP, and where it's going, you would add one more set of numbers to the set of numbers you get from the Department of Finance, the set of numbers you get from the Governor of the Bank of Canada, and from all the other independent forecasters. It's just one more voice. What we're trying to conceive in interpreting the mandate of this officer is to provide you with underlying explanations of what are the factors that are influencing the variations so that you can form your own conclusions about how valid the forecast
that is exactly the point. The Department of Finance gives fiscal forecasts. They are beholden to the Minister of Finance. The Bank of Canada gives monetary forecasts. It uses the same numbers, but it's for monetary purposes. Parliamentarians were frustrated both in the last Parliament and in this Parliament that there was no independent entity that spoke, if you will, for parliamentarians. And now what we find out is that all we're going to do is we're not going to be an alternative voice. We're simply going to be a rehash of the numbers that are already in the public domain, either from independent forecasters or the Bank of Canada or the Department of Finance.
I'll allow a very quick answer and then we'll move on.
Very briefly, I think the independence of the officer and the experience of the officer, you will have very sound economic analysis and advice as required under the statute to provide you with understandings of the government's, of the state of the economy, the national finances, and the government's expenditure plan. That's the statutory requirement.
Okay, thank you. Monsieur Laforêt, the floor is yours. 5 minutes.
Mr. Laforêt, you have 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to come back to the hiring criteria that we were talking about earlier. Now, in your search for a candidate, I would assume that in addition to having accounting capabilities, do you ask if the person is bilingual? Do you require the person to have perfect command of our official languages? What sort of rating do you require? And in terms of the security clearance, or the level of security clearance, are there any requirements on that subject? And is anyone who is currently employed in the Library of Parliament qualified? The criteria matches the criteria that you find for an assistant deputy minister. Our employees already have a very high security clearance because of the array of work that they do. For example, the briefings that are provided for you are provided in the strictest of confidentiality, and we apply the same policies and the same principles. Because what we're dealing with is a senior manager in an already existing structure. Will this entail any sort of reclassification of the current position? Are people going to be reclassified? And I imagine that this would have supplementary costs. Answer: according to the models that we have today, it will have an impact on very senior ranking officials, but it shouldn't have any inflationary effect on the lower ranking employees. You said that the selection process was contracted out to a specialized firm. How many companies were part of the bidding process, and at what cost? No. I don't know how many companies made a bid. Mr. Darling has the number. 6. I believe there were 6 companies. And the contracted was given For whom and for how much?
Just to clarify, 6 national search firms were invited to bid. We only, in the end, received a proposal from one. So there is no question of, but we had to go through that process. The contract is
Quelle est la valeur du contrat? 50 000 $.
How much was the contract worth? $50,000. The person quoted by Mr. Darling earlier did an excellent job. Our contractors did not count the number of hours that they worked. And it could have been much more expensive. In fact, some other firms require that we pay a percentage of the salary of the position that we are seeking to fill. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Now we'll move on to Mr. Wallace. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for coming this morning and or this afternoon. And I just want to clarify one thing so that my colleagues across the way, I understand where their frustration is, but the decision was made in setting this up that instead of loading the budgetary office staffing with a bunch of economists to repeat the forecasting efforts that other independents that are able to do, you're just basically going to contract that out and hire that information. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. My second question is, did the qualification, not the qualification, the classification, that's the word I'm looking for, the classification of the job, and you mentioned in response to another that may be, and I'm just saying maybe, part of the reason why things have not moved as quickly once you've made the selection. There might be a discussion of what that classification should be. Did it affect the quality and quantity of applications to the job?
It did. What happened was that a lot of people were screening themselves out based on the classification of the position.
And that's based on what it would pay?
I think not. Well, that's part of it, obviously. Part of it is also the clout that a classification will give you in any system. For example, this person will be negotiating with people at the highest level in the Department of Finance. If you look at the Ray and Burnson report, I believe it says in the report to me, knowledgeable of the role from the beginning voiced concern regarding the classification and compensation assigned to the position. It was felt that this may adversely affect the profile and seniority of possible candidates, or that individuals could underestimate the importance the government places on the role.
So that could be an issue that's being discussed then, maybe that class should be reclassified, and so I appreciate that. The individuals applying would have known the classification of the job?
That's correct.
Okay. My reading of the, it was in 2006, Budget Plan 2006, and part of the job that I foresee for the position, and I want to know how that was presented to the potential candidates and what your view of the role is that not only do we deal with the fiscal forecast at budget time, how much surplus we're going to have, what the future of interest rates are and all that stuff, but if one of us come up with a crazy idea and want to do something, that the office could provide an independent analysis of that budgetary or that program or that idea. Did you foresee that as part of the role of that budgetary office?
That's in the legislation. The legislation states that the officer will be, as one of his functions, costing proposals by members of Parliament or by committees of Parliament.
And is it broken down to how much time is, is that a lot of their work, a small part of their work? Do we know that?
Quite frankly, that part of the job is going to be demand driven, and that's where I don't know whether the budget's adequate or not. I mean, I'm perfectly prepared to go back and seek more resources if the costing function is going to take up an undue proportion of the individual's time given the other responsibilities he or she might have.
So has the library received cash so far in terms of budgetary allocations? even though there's been nobody in this position as of yet?
Well, we sought last year $250,000 in our supplementary estimates to assist us in setting up the office, but because that did not happen, we returned that money. It lapsed, and we have funded all the activities related to setting up this office internally.
Okay, and do you have an actual office location for such an
Well,
office?
we are currently, most of the library staff are housed at 50 O'Connor, and I sent a letter to the Deputy Minister of Public Works as soon as the office was, or the officer was included in the Parliament of Canada Act, and we currently are going to be getting additional space there for this.
If it happens to get reclassified, will it require a whole new round of applications and search?
I don't believe so. And I will let Mr. Darling explain since he's been in charge of the selection process.
I think just briefly, the search process was very thorough, and it canvassed the community of people who would have the skills and ability to undertake this function. Changing the classification wouldn't change that pool of candidates.
Thank you. We have 6 minutes left. I'm going to split it in the last round between Liberals and Conservatives. Mr. Massimo, Mr. Pichetti, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just quickly, it's because I want to get 2 points in. Again, I want to get to the structure, but before that, I just want to address Mr. Darling's points, both when I asked him the question and Mr. McKay asked. Again, I see this as being a totally independent, but I see that the Parliamentary Budgetary Office giving also, or preparing fiscal forecasts, and along with it, some economic analysis.
Briefly, if that is where the committee indicates to the officer they wish him to undertake his endeavors, I think that is consistent with the Act.
Okay.
Because he does respond to requests from committees.
So, but it's not just about economic analysis, because
no,
we can get
be
that
a
from.
Study of anything.
We're looking at fiscal forecast. That's key. Mr. Young, you also, I think you mentioned it, but also did you interpret the Act to say that it was an independent, or how did that come about?
The library is independent.
No, I understand that, but the Act, in terms of the independent parliamentary office, if everybody felt it was independent, shouldn't the Speaker just, how is the top person at the Library of Parliament, who does he answer to? To the Speaker?
I am responsible to the Speaker of the House of Commons and the Speaker of the Senate.
So wouldn't you think that a position such as this would have been hired or under the responsibility of the Speaker of the House?
Well, he is.
So who would have interpreted that it had to go through? Does it say in the Act? Because I'm not familiar with the Act. Does it say in the Act that the leader of the House, the House leader decides?
Yes, it does.
Okay. And then, in terms of structure, I just want to get to that. You in your paper you discussed 2 levels, which I'm not very familiar with, but EX3 and GCQ5. What is the difference in level of salary or range of salary?
Briefly, the difference is that an EX3 is, I believe, paid $5,000 more annually than a GCQ.
Okay, and the range would be?
I don't have those ranges, but the classification of GCQ, because it's a Q classification, whoever occupies the position is not eligible for performance pay on top of the base salary.
Okay, but are we talking 100,000, 200, half a million, 3 million?
For GCQ 5, they could go to 145,000 approximately.
How much? Pardon?
145,000.
145.
But you will have PCO people here who could
so in terms of structure, what will we do with the remaining? Yeah, just quickly on the 2.7 million. What will we do with the remaining? Say we allocated 200,000. What will we do with the remaining 2.5?
We anticipate a staff allocation that would take about 2/3 of that budget, and a budget for engaging consulting and expert services of the balance.
Thanks very much. Now the final word on this round will be to Mr. Dykstra.
Monday and Tuesday were good, but now it's Wednesday.
Mr. Dykstra.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. McKay made some interesting observations about the Finance Department's hands and where they might be. And I don't know, when he was Parliamentary Secretary, they might have been in places they shouldn't have been. But I certainly don't want to let that go without a response, and simply just ask any one of the 3 gentlemen if they could clarify that the process that you went through, although lengthy, was as independent as you could possibly make it.
I would say absolutely. There has been no discussion in the appointment process with the Department of Finance, with anyone at any political level. As far as notification of individuals at the political level, I will tell you that all House leaders of every party in both chambers received a letter from me indicating where I was in the staffing process and volunteering that Mr. Darling or I would go and meet with those people if there were any questions.
Thank you. I might have a bit of time. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Mr. Menzies.
Well, thank you. And just very quickly, I can see this role expanding as we speak. We have, in our pre-budget consultations, we have many groups and individuals that come to us with an ask for that their project or their ask to fundamentally be included in the next budget, and they will say to us, well, it's only going to cost, $10 million. Those are the numbers we have. Will we have the opportunity then, if time permitting, that this individual have a look at that and see if that estimate is anywhere near accurate?
Well, I don't want to really anticipate too much how the individual is going to define the role, but quite frankly, if I were he or she and I were confronted with the pre-budget consultations that I know you folks undertake, I would volunteer to come before the committee and discuss with you exactly what your needs are, because obviously you have two analysts sitting here and dealing with a lot of this issue. My view is that the budget officer should be value added to the service that you already have and augment that service, not duplicate that service. And I think that's partly an internal piece here, but it's partly also working with you as a committee and individual members to try and find the best way to support you in your work.
Great note to end on.
Thank you very much. It sounds like very good wisdom for that individual whenever he or she gets to it. We will now suspend the meeting as we bring forward the Treasury Board Secretariat area, the Privy Council office, and the Department of Finance. The witnesses, if they would retreat, these would retreat and those come forward. Then we'll pick the meeting up from there. Seeing the witnesses there, we will call the meeting back to order. And if the members would take their seat, we have with us Joe Wild, Executive Director, Treasury Board Secretariat. And I understand that you will be doing your presentation, and you have the resource people beside you that you would introduce. So I will open the floor up to your presentation, and then we'll open it up to question and answer after that. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So before I begin my remarks, I'll just quickly introduce my colleagues who are at the table. Mark O'Sullivan is the Acting Assistant Secretary to the Cabinet for Senior Personnel and Special Projects with the Privy Council Office. And Catherine is with the Department of Finance, as is Benoit Robideau. And they're here, I think, primarily to assist any technical questions that may come up around the specifics of some of the mandate. I'm going to quickly go through some brief opening remarks just to help set some context for the members of the committee. Je vous remercie de cette invitation à comparaître devant le...
I wish to thank you for this invitation to appear before the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance to discuss the implementation of the Federal Accountability Act, and especially the implementation of a parliamentary budget officer position.
Of the Act, I propose to update the committee on the overall progress that has been made by the government. Comme les honorables sénateurs le savent, la loi fédérale sur la responsabilité modifiée 46 lois.
As honourable members know, the Federal Accountability Act amended 46 existing statutes and created 2 new ones. Some of these changes came into force at royal assent on December 12, 2006, while others were subject to coming into force dates set out in the Act or established by order in Council.
Accompanied by the Federal Accountability Action Plan, which organized the various elements of the Federal Accountability Act along 14 themes, as well as setting out related policy initiatives. I will now provide some details on the highlights of the government's progress in implementing the Act and Action Plan along those themes. So with respect to the reforming of the financing of political parties, this element has been fully implemented. The relevant statutory amendments came into force on January 1, 2007, and these measures are currently being administered by the Chief Electoral Officer. With respect to banning secret donations to political candidates, this element has been fully implemented. The final statutory amendments came into force on July 9, 2007, and these measures are currently being administered by the Chief Electoral Officer and the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner. Strengthening the role of the Ethics Commissioner, this element has been fully implemented. The new Conflict of Interest Act came into force on July 9, 2007, and on that date, Ms. Mary Dawson was appointed to the new position of Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner. In terms of making qualified government appointments, statutory amendments to provide parliamentarians with more say in the appointment of agents of Parliament, to revise the process for appointing returning officers under the Canada Elections Act, to provide for the creation of a Public Appointments Commission, and to remove entitlements to priority appointments within the public service for ministerial staffers have all come into force. With respect to cleaning up government polling and advertising, most of the items under this heading have been implemented, including statutory and policy changes and contract regulations, which came into effect on June 7, 2007. Providing real protection for whistleblowers, the amended Public Service Protection Act was brought into force and operational as of April 15, 2007, and appointments have been made to both the Office of the Public Sector Integrity Commissioner and the Public Servant Disclosure Tribunal. In terms of strengthening the access to information legislation, all of the statutory amendments under this element have been brought into force. The Access to Information Act has been expanded to include 69 additional institutions, which comprise agents of Parliament, several foundations created under federal statute, 7 additional parent Crown corporations, and all subsidiary Crown corporations. With respect to strengthening the power of the Auditor General, all the statutory elements under this element have been brought into force. Regulations are also being developed in order to support the Auditor General's authority to inquire into the use of funds under federal funding agreements. Strengthening auditing and accountability within departments, deputy heads have been designated as accounting officers under the Financial Administration Act. Statutory amendments have been made regarding the governing structure of Crown corporations, and a new offense has been created for fraud involving public monies. In terms of creating and establishing the Director of Public Prosecutions, the Office of the Director has been created and it is operational. An acting director has been appointed pending a permanent appointment to this position, and it has been that way since the Act received royal assent on December 12, 2006. We have also ratified the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. That convention was ratified on October 2, 2007. In terms of cleaning up procurement of government contracts, several items under this element have been completed, including the incorporation of an overarching statement of principle on procurement in the Financial Administration Act and the adoption of a new code of conduct for procurement on September 19th. A procurement ombudsman designate has been appointed. Draft regulations were posted in the Canada Gazette December 22nd, 2007. In terms of toughening the Lobbyist Registration Act, the government has developed proposed regulations for the coming into force of the Lobbying Act. The consultations on those regulations is now closed. The regulations are going through the process of being finalized in order to be brought forward for deliberation by the Governor and Council. The establishment of a parliamentary budget authority, as you know, this item remains to be fully implemented. The Accountability Act established within the Library of Parliament the position of Parliamentary Budget Officer. The new officer will provide research and objective analysis to the Senate and House of Commons concerning the state of the nation's finances, the estimates of the government, and trends in the national economy. The parliamentary librarian, under which the responsibility for the selection process of the Parliamentary Budget Authority falls, has highlighted current progress made on the matter. So, quickly in conclusion, beaucoup de travail a été accompli durant la dernière année relativement à la loi.
There's been a lot of work done in the last year on the Federal Accountability Act, and I want to assure this committee that across the government, we continue our hard work to implement this important piece of legislation.
That concludes my opening remarks, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions committee members may have. I understand that Mr. O'Sullivan has a few brief remarks.
Merci. Juste pour préciser très brièvement.
Just to clarify very briefly, just as the Library of Parliament librarian said earlier, the recommendation was made to the government, and the government does have the names in hand, and we hope to move very quickly with this appointment. And that's where we are at. I'm ready to answer your questions.
Okay, thank you. With that, we'll move to Mr. Bichetti, and we will allow 5 minutes.
Well, I think with those opening remarks, I think we can all go home. It looks like for a government that doesn't like much government, there seems to be a lot of extra positions, but the one that we're interested in, all of a sudden, seems like Mr. O'Sullivan has answered a question. The person is going to be hired imminently, just by coincidence. So I'm not sure if I have to ask the questions or if we just wait till Monday and we see what happens. But the fact that I have a couple of minutes, I guess you were here, or I guess you heard some of the testimony that Mr. Young regarding the Library of Parliament, and I think some of the feeling around the table is, in terms of the structure, in terms of, is this going to be an independent parliamentary office, and is this going to be answerable only to Parliament? I guess the question is for Mr. Wild. Is that what's going to happen, or did we make a mistake in adopting this particular position and putting it into the Accountability Act?
Under the Federal Accountability Act, the amendments to the Parliament of Canada Act clearly establish the office of the Parliamentary Budget Officer within the Library of Parliament. The Library of Parliament is an institution of Parliament, and as such is independent of the executive. It is overseen by the Board of Internal Economy and through the speakers of the two houses. So certainly from the government's perspective, this is an independent office.
So I mean, I understand that you hired, or you've engaged, or I think it was the Library of Parliament. That's not even clear. An independent firm to conduct the work for finding somebody. But what happens afterwards? Like, who takes care of firing him? Is it going to be the government, or is it going to be the Speaker of the House?
Well, with respect to the appointment process, Mr. O'Sullivan would be the best position to answer.
The legislation sets out that the appointment is made of the Parliamentary Budget Officer is made by the Governor and Council, so by Cabinet, by Commissioner under the Great Seal. So that's a position that's done, that's at pleasure of the government.
But is that, again, because we have limited time, I don't mean to interrupt you, but is that not contradictory to what Mr. Wilder said?
No, because there are many positions within the Parliament that are parliamentary officers are appointed by the Governor and Council, starting with the Clerk of the Senate, the Clerk of the House of Commons, the Usher of the Black Rod, the Deputy Clerk, the Sergeant at Arms, the Clerk Assistant, the Law Clerk and Parliamentary Counsel, and the Parliamentary Librarian, as well as the Associate Parliamentary Librarian.
Those are orders of Council?
Those are all appointed by the Governor and Council, yes.
Okay, so what's the next step now? So are we going to give the green light for Library of Parliament to hire this person, or do we have to wait? I'm still not clear on that.
The recommendation has been made by the selection committee to the government, and the government is proceeding with that appointment. As I said, there have been discussions with the candidate around the issues around remuneration and the classification of the position. Those discussions are not yet completed.
Okay, when do you foresee those discussions to be completed by?
Well, we're trying to complete them as soon as we can.
Well, is there a time frame?
Well, we'd like to get this done in the next couple of weeks before the end of the month.
Okay. Just quickly, Ms. Rico and Mr. Robideau, has there been any input from the Department of Finance regarding this position?
You mean regarding the process?
Both the process and what the independent, well, not independent, but what the Parliamentary Budget Office is going to do, the role?
Not about the process and not about what it's going to do now.
Okay, so what input did you have to do with this whole process?
Well, this was an item in budget 2006 has been put in the framework as other items, part of the Act, and our work stopped there.
And there was no other input given by Finance to the other department.
Sorry, just on that, I am aware that the search firm did contact the Department of Finance, at least one person in Finance, to discuss the qualities in terms of what characteristics would be needed in such a person as might be expected of an executive search firm, looking at the Department of Finance as a guide to the type of people you might require.
Okay, but no details in terms of what the job would entail and what interaction there would be between the
That's
Parliamentary
correct.
Office and
no interaction at all that way.
Okay, how much time? Okay, okay.
Give 10 seconds, but.
Okay, I'll wait. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kret, and I believe you're going to share your time.
Oui, rapidement.
Yes, very quickly. Now, an acting director was appointed because it was stipulated in the Act that this was made possible. This is under point number 10 of your presentation, Mr. Wilds. You say that the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions has been created and is operational. This is allowed for under legislation, but in the Parliamentary Code, is this allowed, or was it a decision of the government to exercise that power?
In terms of the Director of Public Prosecutions, it's a specific statutory provision in the Act that created the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions. It contemplated that there would be an acting appointment because the specific process to select the candidate that would fulfill the position on an ongoing, well, for the term that was set under the Act, the 7-year term, it's a very complicated search process that involves a number of stages and steps.
Was there anything that prevented you from appointing an acting PBO, at least until a permanent appointment could be made? Did the government have that option?
There's nothing in the statutory authorities around the parliamentary budget officer to appoint somebody on an interim basis. There's a specific process set out in the Act for how the selection is to work.
And that was allowed for public prosecutions. Under the Act, a Director of Public Prosecutions could be appointed given an acting status, but not for the PBO. Why is this? Because lawmakers didn't necessarily prohibit that action. Couldn't the government exercise the option of appointing someone in an acting position? An order in council must have enabling legislation to give the government authority to issue such an order. The government, well, Parliament delegates that power to the Governor and Council. But in the Economic Development Bank, there have been many acting positions and extensions of 6 months. at least until a person was found to fill that position on a permanent basis. Those are possibilities that are built in the enabling legislation. So yes, in the case of the Canadian Economic Development Bank, they are able to make acting appointments. But we need legislation to do so, which is not the case here. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Earlier, Mr. Crête had asked a question to our first panel. Now, the PBO, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, is a position that addresses the concern that each year there seems to be discrepancy between the government's forecasts and its stated surpluses. Would you agree? Because for the last 10 years, the government has always said that there is a more than $10 billion discrepancy between initial estimates and the final surplus that is announced.
The motivation of the government to create the position. What I can speak to is that Parliament, in passing the Federal Accountability Act, established a clear mandate for the Parliamentary Budget Officer. And in that mandate, it certainly includes the possibility de fournir au Sénat et à la Chambre
to provide the Senate and the House of Commons at an arm's length an analysis of the country's fiscal and financial outlook as well as trends in the national economy.
There is certainly a broad mandate there for the Parliamentary Budget Officer, and I think then ultimately it falls between the Librarian of Parliament, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, and parliamentarians as to how that mandate is actually going to be carried out and discharged once that position is filled.
Thank you very much. We'll move to Mr. Del Mastro, I believe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Wild, you're the Executive Director of the Strategic Policy at the Treasury Board Canada Secretariat, correct?
Yes, I am.
Wonderful. Okay, well, it's very timely that you're here today because I'm looking at your handout, specifically point 1, where it says reforming the financing of political parties. You indicate that this element has been fully implemented.
Correct.
I was part of a committee that worked on the former Bill C-2, the Accountability Act. Subbed in on that committee several occasions, and contrary to my understanding, if what you're saying is true, that this is fully implemented, can you please tell me how there is a political party that is having a sky's the limit fundraiser this evening with auctions where you can bid as much as you want, you can take corporate checks, business checks, you can pay as much as you want for golf with the Right Honourable Paul Martin, you can pay as much money as you want for lunch with Scott Bryson. You can pay as much as you want to go to a hockey game with Ken Dryden. At what point? I have a valid question here, Mr. Chair, because the witness has indicated that this is
Order. Okay. We'll, Mr. DeMastro, I think you made your point on the question.
My question, Mr. Wild, is given these facts, how can this be fully implemented? Because that is not consistent with the Accountability Act. How can it be that this is fully implemented and that fundraiser is going on this evening?
Let's allow an answer now to the question.
The provisions of the Federal Accountability Act that amend the Canada Elections Act are completely in force, and the Chief Electoral Officer is responsible for the enforcement of that act, and any issues around anyone who is or is not complying with that act would ultimately have to be raised with the Chief Electoral Officer.
So a sky's the limit fundraiser taking corporate checks would be inconsistent with the Accountability Act?
Point of order.
Mr. DeMastro,
Mr. Chairman,
I think the question was asked.
Mr. Chairman, I have a point of order.
I'm not going to listen to the point of order.
No, of course not.
He asked the question, and I've ruled on the question. That's enough of that kind of a line. I think you got an answer to that question. So if you have any further questions,
my time,
go ahead.
Mr. Wallace.
Mr. Wallace.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And on topic of what we're discussing in terms of this particular position, the length of time it took for the classification of this position Is that the norm, or would you say you could have done better, or was it difficult because it was brand new? Could you just give me some sense of when the previous speaker told us it took 7 months? Is that, I don't know, that might be just what it takes when a new position is created. So.
No, that's not the norm. That's longer than it normally takes. This case is particularly challenging because of two main issues. On the one hand, there's a desire to have this position classified as at the most senior level possible. Right. It's an important position, it's an important function, and you would want it to be as senior as possible. On the other hand, it fits within an existing structure. It is, under the legislation, the parliamentary budget officer is an officer of the Library of Parliament. And so this person answers to the librarian of Parliament, parliamentary librarian. And so that tells you something right away about where it's placed in terms of classification, because in classification you just don't look at one position independently, you look at it in relation to other existing positions within that organization. And so there was a bit of a ceiling there that we were dealing with in terms of the position, the classification of the position of the parliamentary librarian. We consider the possibility of completely disregarding that and says, well, we'll just classify it as at the level that we think is the right one without regard to the relativities with other positions. But the fact is that there are 9 other Governor and Council positions within Parliament. And if we do away with relativity for the purposes of this position, then we can imagine that the 9 other positions would shortly thereafter ask to be reclassified as well. And people expect to be reclassified upwards. They don't expect to be reclassified downwards. And we have an impact on 9 positions, which is, may not be a good idea from the perspective of taxpayers. So in terms of those two competing pressures, we came out with a classification of 1 level below the level of the parliamentary librarian. Because of the nature of the functions of the budget officer, we thought it was important to give it the additional level of independence of having it not subject to performance pay, that is, that the Governing Council won't be determining performance pay for that position, and so it was put in a range called the GCQ range, Q as in quasi-judicial function, okay. And in order to afford it that level of independence. And so it ended up being classified at the level of GCQ 5, just below the equivalent for the parliamentary librarian, who's a GC 6. Okay.
Does the group who did the review, very quickly, the group who did the review on the short list of who the candidates could be, right? Are you do you get to see that, A, and B, were you satisfied that regardless of this classification, there have been good quality candidates who've applied for this position?
The selection process has been run by the Library of Parliament. We were not directly involved, but we were aware of how it was progressing through informal discussions with the people involved. We were told that there was a difficulty in terms of concern about candidates about the salary level. We were aware of that concern, that difficulty. But in the end, we were told that the selection committee and its communications with the responsible minister has been that they were quite satisfied with the candidate that they proposed as being eminently qualified for the position.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to Mr. McClare. 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Bonjour. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for Mr. O'Sullivan. Now, didn't you realize that we would have had trouble finding candidates and that as a consequence you would have had to change your assessments? Did you have any doubts about your first assessment? This was adopted in 2006. It is now 2008 and we still have no appointment. Did it not come to mind that perhaps you had misclassified it? Answer: yes, it did come up. We had several discussions on how to perhaps change the approach. But in the final analysis, when we compared this position with other senior positions, it was quite obvious. The easy answer is, yes, we're going to bring it up 1 level. That'll cost us more money, but it's not a problem. But you have to consider the impact on the organization as a whole, as well as the impact on other comparable positions. If this results in the promotion of 9 other positions, that causes a problem. I have 30 years of experience in public administration. I was listening to Mr. Wilde earlier, and I very much appreciated what he said when he stated, I'm not going to talk to the government's motivation in tabling this piece of legislation, but what I'm working with is an act. That is very respectful, and I approve of that. I used to be head of an organization as well as a senior official, and so I know both sides of the coin. But honestly, I think you are running roughshod over the government's will. Yes, that is an easy answer, but you talk about relativity, and I think the mandate of Parliament is very clear. You need someone of the highest caliber. That the usher of the black rod would have to be reclassified is a possibility. Well, that's fine. We as elected officials had asked for this. The NDP, in fact, for years have been calling for greater accountability, and I think that Parliament is frustrated because you have decided, and you say this in your own words, that this is unavoidable. So something that was adopted in 2006 has not come to fruition because this is, as you say, unavoidable. Don't you think it's rather paradoxical that it is a paradox that you have put yourself above the will of parliamentarians? With all due respect, our position is in full compliance with what is set out in the Act. The PBO, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, is a member of the Library of Parliament. If we were able to create this position, which is equivalent to other positions within the public service or within arm's length institutions, that would have been very clear. But the fact that the Act states that the Parliamentary Budget Officer is a member, an employee of the Library of Parliament, that sets the framework. And that isn't the decision of the government, it's the decision that comes to the people who oversee the structure. Mr. Young is also a member of the Library of Parliament. Mr. Young is, of course, the chief librarian. The statute can be interpreted in a certain context. And people are telling us now that you are telling us that the interpretation of the Act has frustrated the will of parliamentarians. After all of these obstacles that we've encountered in finding the right person to fill the position, you are saying that perhaps we can review the classification of the position. There's nothing that would prevent you from setting this position at the same level as Mr. Young's. Isn't that correct? The matter of hierarchy, the question as to whether or not this position would be subordinate to the position of the Library of Parliament can be found in the Act itself. It can be found in the Parliament of Canada Act, which talks about the Library of Parliament. And there is a very structured hierarchy. But if there's already an existing framework, that's what we have to work with. In conclusion, Mr. Chair, I've always found that the role of an officer of the state is to find a solution. Every time we've come close to finding a solution, a new problem has surfaced. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just Mr. Wilde, I may have not thanked you. Thank you guys thank you, not just Mr. Wilde, Mr. Sullivan and Department of Finance officials also for appearing. I know it was last second, so, appreciate it. Just quickly, in terms of the budget that's going to be allocated for this, is that going to come out of the Treasury Board budget, Mr. Wilde?
No, the budget for the parliamentary budget officer would be housed within the budget for the Library of Parliament, which, as I understand it, is determined by the Board of Internal Economy. Correct. And then ultimately, after the board determines what it thinks is appropriate, it provides that to the Speaker. The Speaker then provides that to the President of the Treasury Board, who then tables it as part of the estimates before Parliament for Parliament to then vote on.
So it'll be in the envelope for the it'll be in the envelope for Parliament.
Yes.
So once you've appointed now, and so the follow-up will be there. Okay. So once the appointment is going to be done, the involvement of Treasury Board will be over.
Other than responding to requests from the parliamentary budget officer for information, as is set out in the Act, no, there would be no involvement of Treasury Board. The only involvement really of Treasury Board at this point is fundamentally it would be what it does for all of Parliament, and just simply being the conduit for tabling the budgetary requests through the estimates process, and that's it. The only ongoing role beyond that this envisions is the same as it is set out for all departments, which is to respond in a timely manner to any requests from the parliamentary budget officer for information relating to the economy or finances of the country.
Okay, Mr. O'Sullivan, will there be anything once the nomination made? Will there be any input from PCO?
No, once the appointment made, then our role will be completed.
And will it be an order in council that will be renewable after 3, 4, or 5 years? Is there anything?
It's a 5-year term, maximum 5-year term for that position. Okay. And it's renewable. Yes, it is.
Thank you. And a question for all three of the departments. Were there any conditions imposed on this parliamentary budgetary office in terms of, well, this is how it's going to work? Was anything put forward, or are there any conditions in terms of how you view it, Mr. Wild, and the Treasury Board?
There's no conditions outside of whatever is framed within the legislation. So Treasury Board has not imposed any conditions. The legislation sets the mandate and limits of the authorities for the parliamentary budget officer, and the government, certainly the Treasury Board, will be respecting those limits that are set by the legislation.
Okay. And Ms. Rico and Mr. Robido, y a-t-il aucun input pour dire, ben, nous, les conditions, on veut que
do you have any input? Do you believe that the office should behave in such a manner? I have the same answer. I think the mandate is clearly stated in the Act.
The problem with naming a person is because you haven't been able to set your conditions. You haven't been able to tell the person that's going to be nominated, listen, we want to make sure you don't embarrass the government. Is that part of the conditions, and is this part of the delay that's been put forward with your department? Because that's the feeling. I think if you look around the table, I think that's the feeling we're getting. So one of the conditions before you hire the person is don't embarrass the government.
Quick answer.
Well, the answer is no.
It's the same question to all three. It's the same question to all three. Why?
We'll move on now, Mr. Menzies. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Coren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm done. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. Back to the issue of reclassification. If, for example, the committee were to decide that the reclassification was inadequate and required change, we would have to make a recommendation, and it would have to go through the House of Commons and the Senate. At that point, both houses would have to reconsider the matter. Is that correct? Since the heart of the problem is centered on relativity, the question is, can the parliamentary budget officer report to the librarian of the Library of Parliament, or the Speaker of the House of Commons, or the Speaker of the Senate, or both speakers? But given the recruitment problems, to create an equivalent position for independent officers. What I'm trying to understand is, legally speaking, under the Act, could the speakers of both houses address some sort of review of that problem and oversee a classification? Compensation is determined by the Governor and Council. Pursuant to the Act, the PBO will receive compensation that is established by the Governor in Council. But there's a contradiction. If the government decides that in order to attract the right person, they can change that, no? Of course, it's at pleasure. The government enjoys a very broad leeway. But you were saying that this will not apply in the current case, and that notwithstanding the relativity rule, they could set the salary at X amount. The only caveat that I want to signal is that under the provisions of the Parliament of Canada Act that deal with the chief librarian position of the Library of Parliament, deals with subordinates of that position. We received the description of the job. We received documents on qualifications for the position. And from the very beginning, it was understood that the person, the PBO, would be accountable to the Library of Parliament. But there are deputy ministers who are better paid than ministers, and yet the ministers are the superiors. Yes, well, we have cases of heads of crown corporations who are better paid than private corporations, than those of private corporations. Does the PBO have access to all information that is requested of him by officers working in departments? Is he bound to any confidentiality codes? What types of regulations are attached to this position?
On what the parliamentary budget officer can request. The parliamentary budget officer has to request information that's within the mandate, so that's the first limit. Can only ask for what would actually relate to the discharge of the mandate. Second limit is that it is really for financial or economic data that's in the possession of the department. But that financial or economic data cannot include personal information as defined under the Access to Information Act or confidences of the Queen's Privy Council. So those informations are out altogether. Then there's another set of information that the parliamentary budget officer can request and see, but is under an obligation not to disclose unless the disclosure is necessary for the discharge of the mandate. And that's information that would relate to information the government has obtained in confidence from a foreign government, a provincial government, information that would be injurious to federal provincial affairs, information that would relate to trade secrets or that would harm the economic position of the Government of Canada, or information that is commercial, confidential, or received from third parties.
Si un arbitrage à faire, qui va le faire? Si le
But if the PBO wants something from a department and is refused information, who gets the final say? What is the recourse?
The Act doesn't set out an appeal mechanism or anything like that. What the Act does is prescribe a limit on the authorities of the parliamentary budget officer to obtain information. It will ultimately be a question between the department that has been asked to give the information and the parliamentary budget officer as to whether or not the information being requested falls into the information that is not to be provided, which is only the two categories I mentioned, personal information or cabinet confidences. The other group of body of information I was talking about, the parliamentary budget officer can receive it, simply isn't in a position to be disclosing it unless the disclosure is necessary for the discharge of the mandate. So it's just meant to treat it in a confidential manner. And ultimately, it's going to be a discussion between those two parties, and if there's disagreement, because it is a law, ultimately that could then go through lawyers, or it could go to federal court if the parliamentary budget officer wanted to insist on receiving the information to get the interpretation of a judge.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll now move on to Mr. Menzies.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And first of all, I want to compliment you, Mr. Wild, on your written submission to us. Very concise and very precise. We don't always get that precise a presentation given to us, and it's quite factual. We do appreciate it. Something that we haven't talked enough about here today, and I'll be very brief, Mr. Chair, is the value of what we're talking about in here. A number of these that we and Canadians have been waiting a long, long time to see, some of these things that are implemented in this. And the one that strikes me as very apropos today is the powers of the Auditor General, strengthening the powers of the Auditor General. And the one that our chairman and I would agree on is that we can actually now audit the books of the Canadian Wheat Board. I think it's so important today because, let me just put an example in front of you. One farmer in my riding, because of the actions of the Canadian Wheat Board today, has lost access to somewhere in the neighborhood of $20 to $25 million. And I will be quite interested to see the Auditor General's view of what the Canadian Wheat Board did today, actually withdrawing from absolutely the highest record wheat markets in the world that these farmers have ever seen, and they withdrew from selling it, and their mandate is simply to sell it. Anyway, having said that, it's great to see some of these things that we put in this Accountability Act. The one question I have to end up here in item number 10, creating a Director of Public Prosecutions, you suggest there's an acting director in there. When would we expect to have a permanent one?
I'll ask Mr. Sullivan to address the question of the appointment of a permanent director.
The process, it's a very lengthy process that's set out in the bill. It involves committees that are established and that went through a long series of names, and there's consultations required with parliamentarians, and that will be the next step will be to submit. There is a name that it's been whittled down to one name, and the process that has to go through in terms of a nominee appearing before a parliamentary committee is the next step. And
but
so we will proceed with that quickly.
It's functioning as we speak.
Yeah.
We're just waiting for a permanent director. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have one other name on the list. Mr. McClare, I'll allow you to go 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je veux revenir à un autre.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to touch upon another aspect regarding reclassification. I want to talk about the level of bilingualism required. I know that my bloc member has already asked a question. Does the word subordinate figure anywhere in the Parliament of Canada Act? No, the word subordinate does not figure in the Act. Very well, I think that'll make things easier for us. GCQ 5, which is the level you attributed to this position, is for the PBO? No, for the PBO it's GCQ 5, and the Library of Parliament librarian has GCQ 6. So 6, the GCQ 6 would be equivalent to a deputy minister? No, it would be equivalent to the assistant deputy minister that has a salary of approximately $157,000. And what is the salary of the librarian? I can't remember. Appointments to positions made by the governor in council are not confined by a salary scale. When the selection criteria are published and when a vacancy is posted, then of course the level of bilingualism is determined, so it's either preferable or required. And what is that? For the PBO, what is the level of bilingualism required? I don't recall offhand. I believe that the Library of Parliament has that information. So the person who's going to be soon appointed, we've been given that indication. Will that person be able to address us in French? Is that a part of the requirements? I don't know if it's part and parcel of the requirements, but the answer is yes. Very well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Questioner, Monsieur Laforêt, the floor is yours for a couple of quick ones.
Very quickly, Mr. Chair. Tying into the question that was asked by my colleague, Mr. Crête, earlier, we know that the incumbent will have to report to parliamentarians. That's one of the objectives. The PBO will have to speak on the various financial statements of the government. They'll probably have to deal with the public accounts, the Department of Finance, the Treasury Board, in fact, a host of places, if you will, where information is collected, financial information, that is. Earlier, Mr. Crête was asking, if a problem arises, who is going to arbitrate? Because right now there isn't any arbitration mechanism built in. And I'm worried that this is dysfunctional, because one can presume that given the scale of the system with its some $250 billion that circulate, there are going to be problems. In fact, the Auditor General's job is to identify those problems. So what are the checks and balances in place?
I think there's a couple of things. One is that the parliamentary budget officer ultimately works for parliamentarians. From the perspective of public servants, we take very seriously inquiries from the officers of Parliament, whether it's analysts in the library today or the parliamentary budget officer. I think that part of our role as public servants is being very respectful of those requests when we receive them. I think we treat them in a timely manner and as efficiently as we can in responding to them. But in the event that for some reason there was some kind of a conflict, I mean, the parliamentary budget officer has basically, I guess, recourse through a political avenue in raising his or her concerns with the adequacy of response that he or she is receiving from the department with the member of parliament or the committee of parliament that has asked the parliamentary budget officer to pursue the matter. And then that committee or that member have certain tools available to them through the political process and the procedures of Parliament to put pressure upon the government if they feel that things are not going the way they should be. So I wouldn't say that there's absolutely nothing there at the end of the day. I think what's there are all of the procedures and everything else that this place has. And I think it has fairly significant tools to ensure that it gets answers from government.
The
example of the Auditor General, she mentioned in one of her reports before the Public Accounts Committee that she didn't have access to certain figures or documents of the Treasury Board, but at least she had the power in her report to say so. We asked her questions on that. So will the PBO be able to produce similar annual reports and say, for example, I encountered this problem or that problem? I think that would be showing transparency where needed.
The parliamentary budget officer's ability to go back to whoever has made the request for the budget officer to go and investigate something and to report back an issue that the officer is having on obtaining the necessary information from a government department.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for coming in. Thank you for the job that you do, and we look forward to this appointment of the budgetary parliamentary officer. And with that, we want to thank the members for the questions, and we would call this meeting.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Point of order.
I did table a motion with the clerk on Monday. I believe it's been circulated. I believe the clerk has received it. Wondering if we could consider that at this time.
Yeah, no, we won't. You have circulated, that's true, but it hasn't had the 36 hours, which is the standing order of the committee. 36 hours from the time that the committee receives it is what the ruling is, and actually I checked to make sure that that was the case with the previous clerk who said that that was a practice of this committee and is the way that I interpret the rules of order. So that will be taken at the next meeting.
Can I ask the clerk for an interpretation? Because this was submitted to you at 3 o'clock on the 11th of February. And that's 48 hours ago.
The clerk can't circulate anything unless it's in two official languages. It was done at 8 o'clock tomorrow, and that's my ruling.
Yeah, just point of clarification, Mr. Chair. We've got folks sitting here.
Yeah, we do. They can be dismissed for sure, but this one is over. I've ruled on it, and with that, that's a point of order, right? So
surely we've got 5 minutes. We can kick this around, so at least it's a little clearer to the members of the committee. Because when there's
only one way, Mr. Turner, that I'll accept any more discussion on this, and that's if there's unanimous consent to consider it. And I don't hear it.
Mr. Mr. Chairman, this is a matter of procedures.
I'm afraid of nothing.